Hi, my name is Liz Gillis. I'm a local historian and I'm from Dublin, as is my very good friend and colleague Cathy Scuffil. In this four-part series, we're going to be exploring the amazing events and stories of our revolutionary history. We are going to walk the streets and laneways of Dublin 8. We're going to visit buildings and landmarks that hold our nation's past and hopefully show the next generation how they could be proud of their heritage. On Sunday, the 7th of May 1916, Annie, Eileen and Lily Cooney were amongst a group of men and women who attended Mass in the Catholic chapel in Clooney jail. The women were in the balcony while the men were down below. And in the front row kneeling down were four men, Con Colbert, Amy Cant, Michael Mallon and Sean Houston. Annie leaned over to see Con Colbert, who was a very good friend. She was pulled back by the wardress. When the Mass was over, the four men were led out. It was the last time that Annie would see her best friend, Con Colbert. For the very next morning, the 8th of May, Con Colbert, Michael Mallon, Sean Houston and Amy Cant were executed by firing squad in the Stonebreakers Yard in Clooney jail. But why were Annie, Lily and Eileen Cooney in Clooney? To find out the answer to that, we need to go right back to the beginning.
I got mixed up in the national movement through people who are visiting our house. Christopher Bourne, who lived in our house for a long time and was in 1915 a lieutenant of F Company of the 4th Battalion, and Con Colbert, who was captain of that company. It was Con Colbert who proposed me as a member of Cumann Nini branch, which met alternatively at 34 Camden Street and 6 Harcourt Street. We had the lectures on first aid, arms classes, etc. in Harcourt Street and the drill in Camden Street. I was then 18 and my two sisters, Lily, now Mrs Curtin, and Eileen, now Mrs Harborne, joined the same year and the same branch. It was in August 1915 I joined Cumann after the funeral of O'Donovan Rossa. I was selling the commemoration booklet at the funeral. I attended regularly and obtained my certificate for first aid and home nursing. I took part in the route marches and all other activities of the unit. We marched mostly with the 4th Battalion when they were on manoeuvres on the Dublin hills. We used to bring our food on these occasions. We did not light fires as the food we brought was eaten cold.
We're here in the Basin Lane area and it was here that the Cooney sisters, Annie, Lily and Eileen lived. Now the Cooneys were a Republican family. They were very good friends with people that were involved in the Republican movement, be it the Irish Volunteers or Cumann. The Cooney sisters themselves were members of the Nina Heron branch of Cumann. It was made up of girls from all across the Liberties area. Now, a person who lived with the Cooneys was a man called Christy Bourne. He was an Irish volunteer. He later became captain of C Company of the 4th Battalion of the Irish Volunteers. And Annie was very closely associated with another person, and that was Con Colbert, who was very important when it comes to the 1916 Rising. Now, Annie, who was a seamstress, she had a Cumann uniform and the coat was actually based on Con Colbert's Irish volunteer coat. And the week prior to the Easter Rising, the Cooney household was full of activity. You had volunteers coming and going, men like Joe McGrath, Con Colbert, Phil Cosgrave. They were bringing guns, they were bringing ammunition. The girls themselves were getting first aid equipment ready for what was to come. Now, on Easter Monday, the three sisters, Annie, Lily and Eileen, left their home in Basin Lane and they marched off to meet their comrades in the North Avenue. And from there, they set off to take part in an event that would change the whole course of Irish history, the 1916 Rising. Here on the North Avenue, there's a very important building. Now, you may know it, but you may not know its history and its importance to the Republican movement here in the Liberties. And it is this building just here behind me, and that is the Silk Weavers Hall, Cleaver Hall, and presently today it is the home of St. Kevin's Hurling and Camogie Club. This was set up by Michael Mallon in 1904. He was a local man. He was from the Newmarket area in the Liberties, but he was a militant trade union man and he was a silk weaver. So he set up the Weavers Hall for the silk weavers in this area. He was also a member of the Irish Citizen Army. In the Easter Rising, he was the commandant in charge of the garrison in St. Stephen's Green Park and the College of Surgeons, and he was executed for his part in the Easter Rising. So that space was a hub of rebel activity already. However, there was also the Gaelic League. Now, there was an upsurge in people wanting to learn the Irish language. So the Gaelic League set up branches all across the country. The Cleaver branch of the Gaelic League had their home in the Silk Weavers Hall. It was from here, this hall, on the 24th of April 1916, that 25 members of the Anina na hÉireann branch of Cumann, including the Cooney Sisters, marched off to meet up with a company of the 4th Battalion Irish Volunteers to occupy Marrowbone Lane Distillery. Now, it wasn't all serious. While they were waiting for their orders, the girls actually had a ceilidh in there. That place was known for its ceilidhs, and once word came through that they were to march to Cork Street, they stopped dancing, they fell in, and led by their officer, they made their way down to North Avenue. They met up with a company at Cork Street, and from there, they marched straight through to Marrowbone Lane Distillery. Annie Cooney saw her best friend Con Colbert march the other way, for he was to split off and lead his small group down Cork Street to take over Watkins Brewery, which was only a short distance away. Behind me here is Watkins Brewery, and this is occupied by Con Colbert and a small group of volunteers from the 4th Battalion on Easter Monday. Wellington Barracks, what is now Griffith College, is quite close by, and that is why they were in that building. It was to stop any British soldiers that might come down this way, heading in towards O'Connell Street to attack the General Post Office. But no soldiers came. So on Wednesday, they decided that they were going to move up to Marrowbone Lane Distillery to be with the main garrison there, but they were wearing big heavy boots and shoes and they couldn't bring any attention to themselves. So armed with their guns and their ammunition and then their shoes and their boots, they made their way up Cork Street in their stocking feet. They arrived at Marrowbone Lane Distillery, and that is where they remained until the surrender came on the 30th of April 1916. Behind me is the wall of Marrowbone Lane Distillery, and that was occupied members of A Company 4th Battalion and the Anina na hÉireann branch coming on during Easter week. Now, that distillery, it was a huge premises. This whole area was under the command of Eamon Cant. He was commandant of the 4th Battalion, and his main base was the South Dublin Union, which is now St. James's Hospital, so not too far away from the distillery. The reason the distillery was occupied was to prevent British soldiers who might try to get to Eamon Cant in the South Dublin Union from either Rialto or from Marrowbone Lane. Now, of course, this is where Annie, Eileen and Lily Cooney were based, and they marched in with their comrades, they got themselves prepared, and Annie talks about what life was like for them during the Easter Rising in Marrowbone Lane. They had a great time. They're one of the best fed garrisons in the Easter Rising. They had 19 chickens. Now, unfortunately, they hadn't got any cutlery, so they had to cut up the chickens with bayonets, so the swords that were on the guns of soldiers. And also, they had stolen 2 cows, so a very well-fed garrison. Now, the typical duties of the women was to carry out first aid. It was a conflict. There was gun battles going, and unfortunately, volunteers were wounded. One was Mick Liston. Annie Cooney was based in the loft in the distillery, and she talks about how they treated Mick Liston. Now, he wasn't seriously wounded. Once they fixed him up, he was back up and he was shooting away at the British troops. So despite the fact that they were in a rebellion, they also had a bit of fun. And on Sunday, the 30th of April, the girls were actually planning to hold a ceilidh, but the ceilidh never happened because it was that day that the surrender came. And Annie talks about seeing Eamon Kent come to the distillery to tell the garrison they must surrender. Now, the women were given the option to leave, go home, like they had been in the other outposts, but the women of Inina refused to leave their comrades. They were their brothers, they were their friends, they were their sweethearts, they were their neighbours. They had shared the fate of that week with them, so whatever the future may hold, they would share that. So they lined up, the girls fell in behind the volunteers, and they left Marrowbone Lane Distillery, marched off towards Patrick's Park where the surrender would take place. Now, while they were marching down through the Liberties, you had the volunteers throwing away their guns, trying to get them away from the soldiers. The girls were picking them up and hiding them under their big skirts, of course, including Annie Cooney. And at the end, they were looking back, reflecting on what they had done for the last 6 days. They had held out for 6 days, and those 6 days shook the British Empire. After the rebels surrendered, they were brought to Richmond Barracks here in Inchicore, and amongst them were 77 women who had taken part in the rising, and that of course included the Cooney Sisters. But the women were held separate from the men. They were held in what was the married quarters of Richmond Barracks, and they were split into 2 or 3 rooms. And Annie Cooney, she had managed to hide a gun on her after the surrender. She hid it under her skirt, and she decided that she would hide that gun, and where she hid it was actually in the chimney stack in the room that she was in. Now, how she ever thought that once she was set free, if she was set free, she was going to get into a military barracks, get back into the room that she was held in, and locate the chimney stack and get that gun back, I don't know. But what this shows is that the women were looking to the future. They knew 1916 was only a battle in a revolution that was to come, and the women were determined that they were going to be part of that coming revolution.
We had the same routine every day till the Sunday. On that day we were all brought to Mass in the prison church. We were on the gallery, from which we only had a view of the altar and the front seat. We were able to see Eamon Kent, Michael Mallon, Con Colbert and Sean Houston, who were kneeling in the front seat. They were the only ones to receive Holy Communion, which we thought significant. That affected us all, and I began to cry. We craned our necks to try and see more, but the wardresses pulled us back. When the volunteer prisoners were leaving the church, those 4 were the last to leave, and they looked up at us, and we waved down to Con Colbert, who waved his hand in reply, shaking his head up and down as if in farewell. They evidently knew what their fate would be. They were all 4 executed next morning.
On the 8th of May, the majority of the women were released from Kilmainham. Now, the British made a few mistakes after 1916. A big one was that they underestimated the women. Before they were released, the women were told to agree not to do anything like this again. Be good little girls. Of course they said yeah, but as soon as they were released, they hit the ground running. Now, 1916, it was a defeat, but it was only a battle in the coming war. But you had thousands of men arrested after 1916. The leadership, it was gone. They were executed. They had to reorganise. But the families of those men, they had nothing. Kathleen Clark, she set up the Irish Nationalism Volunteer Dependence Fund, and basically this organisation was to raise money and provide money, give money to the families of those men. But who was going to collect that money? It fell to Cumann on. And girls like Eileen, Annie and Lily Cooney, they were members of the Irish Nationalism Volunteer Dependence Fund, and they knocked on the doors in the city and they collected a huge amount of money. And that showed how much public opinion had changed from one of anger against the volunteers into one of support. The whole situation in Ireland was changing. Now the volunteers in Cumann continued to reorganise, and halls were used around the city, like this one behind me. This was Emma Hall on Emmett Road. This has been the home of Michael Mallon, who was executed for his part in 1916. Emma Hall was the home of the Inchicore branch of the Gaelic League, and Eileen, Annie and Lily Cooney were members of that branch. But the 4th Battalion of the IRA, they also used the hall, as did the local girls in Cumann. Now, the Republicans were being watched by the authorities, and places like this, they were being raided. And one day, word came that there was going to be a raid on Emma Hall. Now, the Republicans, they weren't going to give up without a fight, and they determined that they would defend that building. But to defend it, they needed weapons, and Annie Cooney was sent away to get the guns to bring back to defend the hall. However, the military never came, the raid never took place, but the Republicans were ready and waiting for them to come. It didn't happen. The 21st of November 1920 is one of the darkest days in the War of Independence. It's also known as Bloody Sunday. And what happened on that day, Michael Collins, the Director of Intelligence of the IRA, he decided to strike a blow at British intelligence who were really getting close to the IRA. He decided to take them out. Now, women were involved in the planning of this operation. They actually gathered intelligence on where the officers were living, what they were doing, who they were. But they also had a role to play on the day. They were part of the operation, and that included the 3 Cooney sisters, Annie, Lily and Eileen. And Annie later spoke of what their role was on that morning, the 21st of November 1920.
On the Saturday night before Bloody Sunday, about 11:30, we were approached by Christy Bourne, who was OC of FCI of the 4th Battalion. He told us that we were wanted, to be ready at 6 o'clock the next morning, as there was a big job on, and they wanted the 3 of us to be at the University Church at 6 o'clock, and to wait there till he and the 2 others, namely the 1st and 2nd Lieutenants of that company, James Donnelly and Eddie Bennett, would arrive and hand over their guns to us. We were at the church at the appointed time, and to avoid attracting attention, we went into the church in turns, 2 at a time, and attended Mass, while the 3rd remained in the porch and watched. We heard the shooting quite near, as the operations were in progress in that area, and after waiting during what seemed to us an eternity, the 3 fellas came walking along pretty smartly and handed over their guns to us, each one in a laneway between the church and Harcourt Street corner. We put the guns in our pockets and proceeded home via Cuff Street and other lanes, avoiding the main roads. The 3 fellas walked some distance behind us. One of them came the whole way to our house. When we reached a comparatively safe distance from the scene of operations, we entered an open hallway in a slum district, and I handed over the gun I had to Jimmy Donnelly, and he went on his way. My sisters brought the other 2 guns home, and Christy Bourne came with us. We parted with Eddie Bennett on the journey.
Frank Teely was involved in the assassinations on Bloody Sunday, and he was the only volunteer to be arrested on that morning. He had been wounded, and he was arrested, taken to hospital, but once he was recovered, he was brought to Kilmainham jail, and that was being used to house Republican prisoners. You also had in Kilmainham a couple of big names in the IRA, like Simon Donnelly and Ernie O'Malley, and once Frank Teeling was going to be put on trial, there's no doubt he would be found guilty, he would be executed. It was decided they couldn't stay in Kilmainham, they had to get out, so they came up with a plan to escape. They need help from their comrades on the outside. bolt cutters were smuggled into the prison, a rope ladder was smuggled in, but also members of Cumann and the IRA would be outside the jail waiting to assist the men if they needed. Now, there was a couple of attempts, something went wrong, but finally, on the night of the 14th of February 1921, Simon Donnelly, Ernie O'Malley and Frank Teeling came out of their cells. They crept across the exercise yards, got to the gate, and with the bolt cutters, they broke the lock on the gate and just pushed it open. Now, Eileen and Lily Cooney were on the outside watching all this happen, and they saw their comrades creep out of jail and make their way to freedom. And once they knew the men were safely away, they themselves returned to their home in Basin Lane, happy in the knowledge that once again they had struck a blow for Irish freedom. The Irish War of Independence ended in July 1921. After that, the British and Irish governments negotiated a treaty in December. But this treaty didn't give Ireland a republic that so many people had fought for. Instead, Ireland would become a free state. It would have limited independence but still be part of the British Empire. Now, unfortunately, the Republican movement is split into pro and anti-treaty factions. The IRA split and Cumann split. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't come to a compromise. And on the 28th of June 1922, the Irish Civil War began. Now, the Cooney Sisters, they were amongst the women who took the anti-treaty side in the Civil War. The Four Courts, which is quite close by, that was occupied by the anti-treaty IRA. And the man in charge of the garrison there was a man called Paddy O'Brien. Annie Cooney was engaged to his brother, Dennis. They were both from Pym Street. Now, when the war began, the sisters were told to come to this building, South Earl Street, Dispensary. This was occupied by the anti-treaty IRA. It was a first aid post. Marrowbone Lane, which had been occupied in 1916, was once again occupied by the anti-treaty IRA. They weren't here for too long because unfortunately on the 30th of June 1922, the Four Courts exploded. It went up. Paddy O'Brien was wounded in one of those explosions. He was taken to his home in Pym Street, where Annie and her sisters went to see him what was to be the last time. He was later killed in the Civil War. The Civil War lasted a total of 11 months, and in that time, families, friendships, neighbours, they all were involved in this conflict. It was a conflict that traumatised this country. The Civil War is a terrible, dark time in our history, but once again, the Liberties had a role to play in these events that changed the whole course of Irish history. The Cooney family were just one of hundreds of families from the Liberties who took part in the Irish Revolution. And while we have the big names like Michael Collins, Naaman de Valera, the simple fact is that the Irish Revolution could not have happened without the likes of Annie, Lily and Eileen Cooney and their comrades. We walked the streets they walked. We passed by the buildings where momentous events took place. But what the story of the Cooney family shows is that the Liberties community was part of something huge. These streets, our streets, they bore witness to the revolution. In the next episode, Cathy and I will explore the powerful testimonies and stories of the children and what they bore witness to in the Irish Revolution.